The West wants to make Russia pay for its aggression, for its transgressions, for its invasion of Ukraine. The strategy is economic warfare. Back in February, the United States joined hands with like-minded nations of the world to put unprecedented sanctions on Russia. Since the beginning of the war, Russia has been hit with more than 11,000 coordinated sanctions. Economic experts agree that Russia is wounded, but despite the embargoes, Putin's aggression only escalates. Ukraine remains under siege, and the economic sanctions are bleeding many unintended victims. So, 7 months later, you have to ask, have the sanctions failed? Who will pay the real cost of a raging war? And what more can be done to stop Russia? Just weeks after smacking Russia with the biggest sanctions regime in history, President Joe Biden claimed that the measures were causing the Russian economy to crater and reel. And that's exactly what happened for a brief moment. The Russian ruble tanked against the dollar, multinational companies deserted Russia in numbers, and the country's economic outlook nosedived. An economic winter was predicted with hopes that the Russian economy will shrink by more than 15%. However, Russia responded with executive controls, and its economy proved more resilient than anticipated. The ruble's initial rapid depreciation was reversed after Russia limited currency transactions. Further help came as an unintended consequence of the sanctions. Since Russia wasn't allowed to import anything, the ruble kept on gaining strength. Now it is officially the strongest performing currency of the year, and is even stronger than it was before the sanctions. A fortified currency isn't always an indicator of a functioning economy, but other markers show why the Russian collapse hasn't happened at the pace it was predicted. Unemployment hasn't shown a noticeable surge, and 7 months later, Moscow's restaurants and bars remain busy as ever. Grocery shelves are stocked, shopping malls are filled with people. The International Monetary Fund has revisited its initial gloomy forecast and now thinks that Russia's economy will contract by just over 4%. Yes, it's a massive fall, but much better than what was intended. The answer to whether the sanctions work or not is certainly subjective. However, the one indicator of failure is that even after months of sanctions, Russia is keeping the war going. What the West really wanted was to take away Moscow's ability to finance the war. However, Putin remains dedicated to his war and even announced the annexation of Donbas, an area that makes up 18% of Ukraine's total land and is home to 6 million people. Even the early, passionate Ukraine supporters and backers are not as confident now. Elon Musk, for example, recently invited a Twitter war over his controversial comments urging Ukraine to be neutral and suggesting that they should let Russia have the annexed territories. But how is Russia sponsoring the war and defying the worst sanctions in history? For one, Russia has found substitutes to earn billions of dollars every month from oil and gas exports. Turning away from Europe, Moscow has diversified its customer base and is exporting more oil to China and to India. The Russians are offering a 30% discount to any takers, and there are many interested parties. Even Saudi Arabia, the largest oil producer in the world, is now buying Russian crude at a discount for its power plants while freeing up its own resources to sell to other countries. But there's an even bigger problem with the sanctions regime. European countries have failed to find a substitute for their dependence on Russian gas. Any embargoes on gas imports will only come into effect next year, which means the European Union is not in a position to damage the Russian economy too much. While Russia remains starved of much of global trade, its oil and gas exports have shot up. Add to that the benefits of rising commodity prices, and Russia has taken in close to $200 billion through the sales of fossil fuels. To sum the situation up, Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas meant that the sanctions were not comprehensive enough, and many in the United States overestimated and overstated their impact. While Russia sits on a war chest, the sanctions also remain a reality. They haven't yet made a dent in Putin's strategic calculations, but millions are suffering the consequences. Europe pays the price. The current wave of sanctions is different from any collective effort of the past. When Western nations took such measures on countries like Iran and North Korea, their own economies remained safe from any blowback. But the problem with Russia is that Europe needs its fossil fuels, and sanctioning Russia always meant there would be retaliation. While Europe blacklisted Russia, it gave Putin the license to freeze Europe. The Kremlin's first measure was to slash 80% of the supply from the Nord Stream 1 gas pipeline. In all, Russia will cut 75% of its gas exports to Europe, and with winter approaching, governments around the continent are scrambling for alternatives. That is far from a straightforward task, because in 2021, Russia supplied half of Europe's gas imports. In anticipation of the coming shortages, gas prices have soared to historic highs, and even though Russia is supplying much less than before, it is making a bigger profit. Consumers in Britain now face the prospect of a 200% increase in their gas bills, while Germany is figuring out ways to combat the 3% decline in GDP after a ban on Russian imports. The political right in France is getting louder, and its leaders have labeled the sanctions ineffective. For the president of the far-right party Rassemblement National, RN, the sanctions serve no purpose except to make the people of Europe suffer. Europe is plunging fast into an energy crisis, and the upcoming winter will only serve to make the crisis worse. And then there's Ukraine. According to the World Bank, Ukraine's economy will shrink 8 times more than that of Russia. Ukraine will see a 35% contraction in its GDP compared to just 4.5% for Russia. Even if the war ends by the end of the year, the recovery would be slow, and the cost to rebuild would be a massive $350 billion, almost twice the size of Ukraine's pre-war GDP. It's not just Europe. The whole world is looking at an energy crisis. With chaotic supply chains, everything is inflated and millions are on the verge of starvation. But there is a silver lining. Despite the hard times, Europe seems to have doubled down on its position to ban Russia. Sooner or later, it's bound to make an impact. When will the sanctions work? Does this all mean that Russia will escape the consequences of the Ukraine offensive? The answer is no. The impact of Western measures has not been as swift as expected. However, the truth is that the Russian economy and society in general are under immense stress, and it will stay that way for a long time. Ever since the Russian invasion, thousands of highly educated people have fled the country. Hundreds of foreign companies have stopped operations, and Russia has lost access to the technical expertise of the West. The economy has mostly survived on oil, but the model is highly unsustainable. Moscow has defaulted on its foreign debt for the first time in a century, and experts believe that 15 years of economic growth will be erased after the sanctions. Russia has officially reported a federal budget deficit of 900 billion rubles, which is equal to 8% of the country's GDP. The only problem is that none of it is happening quickly enough. To make that happen, the European Union needs to cut Russia's oil and gas exports altogether. Restricted purchases are keeping Russia afloat while not doing enough for the European economy. But now we know that Europe is not ready for such a radical step just now, and a collapse cannot be expected until next year. It should be understood that the picture is not all rosy for Russia. One big concern for them is that after losing access to European technology, the gap between Russia and the advanced economies will continue to get bigger. After the end of the Cold War, Russia gradually accepted the global interdependence regime, and in absence of global cooperation, the country is bound to suffer in the long term. Russia is already relying on less advanced weaponry from countries like Iran and North Korea. Depending on lesser technologies will take away Russia's ability to repair and use Western machinery. These impacts are projected to kick in by the end of next year. If the war goes such a distance, Russia may not be able to make tanks, missiles, and fighter jets to compete with the West. So, the possibility of a years-long conflict is limited. Away from the battlefield, Russia has started to face economic consequences at every level. Retail sales have fallen 10% from where they were last year, with people limiting their spending. Consumer confidence has not been lower in years, with 78% of the population avoiding major purchases. Sanctions mean that Russia's imports have fallen drastically, and since a lot of sectors depend on materials from abroad, the impact will be felt all across the board. Data from different industries can help understand how much Russia will suffer. Almost 99% of the country's poultry production and 30% of dairy cattle output depend on imports. The aviation industry is a direct affectee, as 95% of passenger volume is carried on foreign-made planes. Without access to airplane spare parts, the fleet will shrink and many vehicles will go out of service. Russia's local industry cannot provide vehicle parts. Automakers are now compelled to make cars without airbags and several other safety features. Russia's telecom sector is tipped to fall 5 years behind its Western counterparts due to restrictions on SIM cards. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry will be reduced to low-grade medicines, as 80% of production relies on imported raw materials. All these problems will compound for Russia over time, causing a deep recession that may well last for decades. But in the meantime, Putin might just have done something that can speed up his own country's downfall. Putin's mistake? When the world launched sanctions against Russia, the hope was that once the population feels the impacts of a recession, they'll start speaking up against the government. The pressure of public opinion was supposed to force Putin's hand and bring around a swift end to the conflict. However, we have not witnessed such panic just yet, as Russian oil saved the day. But now, Putin's latest decree for his people may become the catalyst for an uproar within the society and may send the economy into an immediate catastrophe. Putin has announced a partial mobilization, a decision to send more than 300,000 men aged between 18 and 30 to take part in the fight in Ukraine. Reserves to fight in Ukraine, sparking widespread protests across the country. This is Russia's first mobilization decree since World War II, and some speculate that the real number of men to be sent off is over 1 million. The decision has caused widespread uproar, and hundreds of thousands of Russian men are fleeing the country to avoid being drafted. Protests are spilling out onto the streets. The Russian police have arrested more than 2,000 citizens since the orders. Russia's less developed regions will face a shortage of men and a massive lack of skilled labor. Thousands of families will be left without an income as they depend on the male population to provide. It's estimated that 3 to 4 million men will disappear from the labor market, and there aren't enough skilled women who can step in and fill the gap. However, sanctions alone are not doing enough to stop Russia. Putin is probably too far into the war to stop abruptly and will probably need assurances from the West if he is to retreat. For the countries in the West, lessons should be drawn from previous regimes of sanctions against different countries. Sanctions failed to force North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons program. They did not make Syria's Bashar al-Assad resign. Instead, he became more dangerous. Putin is decisively more powerful than any of the leaders in these countries, so sanctions alone won't end the war in Ukraine. Not anytime soon, at least. Any impact desired from the sanctions will be gradual. However, the suffering of the war is immediate, and not just for its direct victims, but for millions of unintended victims around the world. So what do you think can be done to put Russia on the back foot? Are economic sanctions enough? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.